Verse 9, as I looked, thrones were set, this is Daniel, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool, his throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Verse 10, a river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Verse 13, this is still Daniel's vision. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And then verse 14, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. End quote. So that's Daniel. Now here's Biblical Unitarianism's explanation. The Ancient of Days is Yahweh. Note his description as a man. Into his presence comes, quote, a son of man, end quote, who's given authority and dominion. It's quite universally agreed among Christians that the Ancient of Days, quote unquote, is God the Father, and the Son of Man, quote unquote, is Jesus Christ, who receives his authority from God. Note that in this passage, there's no hint of the Trinity. There's no Holy Spirit, quote unquote, and no indication that the Son of Man, quote unquote, is co-equal or co-eternal with the Father. On the contrary, Biblical Unitarianism says, while God is called the Ancient of Days, right, in quotes, because it's lifted from the Bible, a title befitting his eternal nature, Christ is called, in quotes, a son of man, in quote, right, again, lifted from the Bible, meaning one who is born from human parents, which is, as I interject, the Hebrew ben-Adam or bar-Enosh in the Aramaic, if I remember from memory, but ben-Adam in the Hebrew, that literally means son of man, but it means human being. Son of man is an idiomatic phrase in the Hebrew and in the Aramaic for human being. So I understand. I agree with that. It's befitting of his eternal nature because Christ is called Son of Man, meaning one who's born of human parents. That's 100% accurate. All right. Biblical Unitarianism continues under point 3 of 4 points. This prophecy is one of many that shaped the Jewish people about their Messiah. And that is this. He was not foretold as God in the flesh, but rather a man like themselves who would receive special honor and authority from God. For our purposes in understanding Genesis 1:18, these verses in Daniel demonstrate very clearly that God can and does appear in human form. And because in Daniel's vision he is with the Messiah when he does so, there's no reason to assume that the other times he appears, it is actually Jesus Christ. In other very clear record, the other very clear record is Revelation 4-5. The length of the record prohibits us from printing it here, but the reader is encouraged to read those two chapters, and then they give you kind of a summary. They portray God sitting on a throne, surrounded by elders and creatures who repeat, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty," end quote. God is holding in his right hand a scroll that is written on both sides, but sealed shut with 7 seals. An angel calls out to summon those who could open the scroll, but no one was worthy. They continue in their summary of Revelation 4 and 5. As John began to weep, an angel comforted him with the words, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll." Then a lamb, the context makes it clear is Jesus Christ, they mention, came and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne, end quote. At that point, they let you know, the creatures and the elders fell down before the Lamb and started singing a new song. So they remind us, this is Biblical Unitarianism. The record is clear. God is described as sitting on a throne and even holding in his hand a scroll that Jesus comes and takes from him. This record again shows that God can and does occasionally take on human form so that we can better identify with him. And then point number 4 of the 4 points, and it's the last one, it's very short. This record and the others like it show how a glimpse of what Christians have to look forward to. God loves us and created us to have a deep and abiding relationship with him. He will not always remain as distant as he now sometimes seems. The Bible tells of a time when, quote, the dwelling of God is with men and he will live with them. They will be his people and God himself will be with them and be their God, end quote. And that's taken from Revelation 21, verse 3. And that is the end of their explanation on Genesis 18, 1 and 2, where God comes and visits Abraham. Now, we've got just a little bit of time. I'm going to whet your appetite. I will definitely spill this over into next week and maybe even a week after. But as I begin to turn from biblical Unitarianism's explanation and begin to look at my own viewpoints, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into Genesis 18 and start looking at some key details from the English that were carried over from the Hebrew. And so we'll just whet your appetite with this. When we get to Genesis 18, we're going to notice that it is the Lord, YHVH, the tetragrammaton name, as you can see right there on your screen. The Lord, that's typified by your English as capital L-O-R-D. The Lord is the one who dialogues with Abraham in this chapter. We're going to look at the Strong's Concordance for the Hebrew word for see, right? When we talk about seeing God, and Abraham saw God or saw Yahweh, was it see as in to know or perceive, or was it see with the eyes? What does the Hebrew lexicon have to say about that? We'll look at that Hebrew word ra'ah in time. We're also going to turn to the Greek rendering to glean some nuggets from there. I've got a GreekDoc.com website pulled up that allows me to see both the Hebrew and the Greek, meaning the Septuagint, as rendered in two different versions, the Alexandrinus as well as the Vaticanus versions of the Septuagint. As you can see on your screen right now, we got the Alexandrinus on the left side and the Vaticanus over on the right side there. And so we'll in time look at those passages. I won't read the whole passages, but we'll definitely look at the Greek word for see or appeared as it's rendered by the translation in the English you can see on the bottom of your screen there. And so we'll look at that Greek word in time, because that's going to carry over into our New Testament lookups and references, cross-references of people seeing God. The Greek of the New Testament may or may not differ from the Greek rendering from the Old Testament. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but it helps us in our structural analysis. We are eventually going to turn to Exodus chapter 3 and look at how Moses interacted with a theophany known as the angel of the Lord, and compare and draw notes and contrasts from Abraham's interaction with this theophany that was God, Yahweh, and draw some comparisons and notice some details that are relevant for us as we interact with both of these gentlemen who interacted with God. Won't be a full exegetical look because eventually we'll probably get to that in our studies themselves. We're also going to turn to Exodus 24, where, let's see, let me turn to it. I lost my, there we go, my bookmark here. In Exodus 24, we'll see that Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu and 70 elders of Israel went up and see God. Go up to the mount and see God. We'll talk about what it means there as well. We'll look at the verbs, seeing God. We'll look at the details. Try to ascertain, is this a vision? Is it just that they're knowing God? So we're working from the kind of the premise that biblical Unitarianism kind of set forth, that seeing God is really knowing God, and or just seeing God, but not necessarily seeing a pre-incarnate figure known as Jesus. All right, we're going to test their theory out. We'll look at Exodus 33, where Moses also asked to see God and to see his glory. Show me your face. God says you can't see my face and live. That passage there is in view there in Exodus 33. Then we're going to jump all the way forward to Isaiah 6, and we're going to notice how the book of Isaiah describes a vision that Isaiah had. He sees the Lord sitting on a throne, but it's visionary language, because he sees the Lord, he sees his throne, he sees the seraphim. What was he seeing? Was he really seeing God? Was it a vision? And who was he seeing? Was he seeing God? Was he seeing the angel of the Lord? What's going on? We're going to look at that in time, because it bears relevance to this idea of seeing God. Remember, biblical Unitarianism says that Abraham saw God. He didn't see a pre-incarnate figure that we would later call Jesus, a pre-incarnate Jesus. He actually saw God because God allowed himself to be seen. It was a simple in the sense that it's just there's nothing more. We don't need to add to it, they say. It was simply a theophany where God manifested himself to look like a man. And why not? Because God's all powerful. He can do that. He created man. He knows what man's made of. He can certainly manifest himself if he wants to. So they're simply saying that Abraham saw God, saw Yahweh, and there's no reason for us to say that he saw Yeshua. But we're going to begin to look at Isaiah 6, and this is going to become a relevant passage that we're for our studies in a reason that you'll see here in a moment. But eventually, we're going to look through that Daniel passage. We'll look at some nuggets there. They already referenced it, but I want to look at some more nuggets on my own because they didn't reference any of the Hebrew or the Aramaic or the Greek. But I will do so when the time comes. We're going to turn to the book of John as well, and we're going to look at that passage more closely that they reference. No man has seen God. The verse that they looked at. Let's see, where is it? Scroll down to it. I apologize. There we go. It's verse 18. John 1:18. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who's in the bosom of the Father. He has explained him. We'll look at that as well. We'll also turn over to John 1:18 and look at different versions because they didn't bring this out, but I'm going to. The John 1:18 passage exists as a variant by two of the main manuscript families. I don't want to spoil it for you tonight. But if you have a KJV rendering of the Bible, it's going to be drastically different than if you have, say, an NASB or ESV version of the Bible when it comes to this particular passage. And so we'll look at those, the reason why those variations are important. We'll look at the different Greek texts, as you can see on my screen right now. We'll look at about, I think, 12 different. I'm not going to read all of the Greek texts, but I'll just highlight where those differences are and why they're relevant for this discussion eventually. We'll look at a textual analysis of each of those different Greek words, why that's relevant for our discussion in time. We're also going to look at the Strong's Concordance number of that Greek word to see as pulled through the lens of the New Testament passages that use it, not just the Septuagint passages that use that same Greek word, right, or a similar word. But we'll get to that in time. And then we will turn to John 6, where there's a discussion from Yeshua where he talks about, let me turn to it here. Yeshua's talking about believing in the Father and then believing in himself. And then Yeshua also utters the phrase, let me find it here. Do not grumble. Yeshua utters the phrase in verse 46 of John 6, not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. So he uses this phrase, seeing, again. But the context of that passage is extremely important and fascinating for us to look at. We'll get to that in time as well, probably next week. Then we're going to turn to John 12, and we're going to find that John 12 has a reference in it that is very relevant to, let me scroll down to it. Let's see, here we go, starting at verse 38. Yeshua is going to start talking about Isaiah, and that's going to take us back to the Isaiah 6 passage. But I don't want to spoil it for you now. Unless you want to read ahead on your own, read John 12 on your own, and then go and read Isaiah 6 on your own and see if you catch it. But we'll get to it in time. It'll be very relevant for us in talking about seeing God. And then we'll turn to John 14, where Yeshua also talks about seeing, I believe. Thomas has this discussion with him, and Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and things like that. We'll talk about what this could mean in terms of, is Yeshua just talking about knowing God, or is he actually talking about seeing God, right? And then eventually we'll also get to Colossians, where Paul talks about how that Yeshua is the, let me scroll down to it. In verse 15, Yeshua is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. What does that mean? How does that factor into this discussion about seeing God, especially if Paul calls God the invisible God, and yet Yeshua is the image? The Greek word is icon, from where we get our English word icon. Yeshua is the icon of the invisible God. What does that mean? And how does it bear relevance to this discussion about Abraham seeing God in Genesis 18? And then in drawing our study to a close eventually, like I said, this will spill over into next week and possibly into the week after. I'm envisioning at least another 2 weeks. 1 Timothy 6 contains another reference where, as I scroll down to it, I apologize. Before I blew up my screen, they can see it right now. The reference was parked where I needed to be. But when I increased the font on my screen, the bookmarking disappeared, and so now I have to scroll down to find where I was before. It's not like I wasn't prepared earlier. Ultimately I was unprepared, so I apologize. I didn't anticipate that the blowing up would make my bookmarking stray. But 1 Timothy talks about how that God dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. So we're going to eventually get that 1 Timothy 6:16. It's a well-known passage, and see how it bears relevance to what biblical Unitarianism has to say, as well as the idea of Abraham seeing God in Genesis 18. And then lastly, we'll turn to 1 John 4, where John has this great discussion about knowing God and God making himself known to us. And yet in that same discussion, he talks about seeing God as well, which kind of goes back to what biblical Unitarianism was highlighting about knowing God and seeing God and how those words play off of one another. So eventually, that's where we're going to go. I won't talk about that tonight because it would just take a whole another hour, and I'm trying to keep this part of the study short down to 30 minutes, or sometimes it goes over to 40 or 45 minutes. But for now, that's where we're going to go. So I hope you stick around next week and likely the 2 weeks after. So it'll take 3 weeks to go through Genesis 18 and talk about seeing God. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.